All right, on to file item number 16.
Yeah,
Dan,
well-
it's single-year water transfers in the Delta Plan.
Maybe I could just say a few words by introduction while Mr. Sampson comes up, and I think we've got a PowerPoint for this one as well. You know, this year especially, we see the importance of water transfers as a tool to improve the reliability of our water supplies. We're able to move water from areas that have a little more ample supply to areas that have a woefully inadequate supply. And that's important as a flexible system that can respond in different ways from year to year as conditions change. When the council developed the Delta Plan, I think there was a recognition that the transfers were an important element in strategies to improve reliability, but there were also nagging questions about how adequately they were overseen to make sure that both goals of the Delta Reform Act were being addressed. There was a concern that perhaps single-year water transfers, some of which get less scrutiny, were being used inappropriately, perhaps, to avoid that kind of oversight. And I think so the council, both wanting to improve the opportunity to use transfers, make sure that they can be done as expeditiously as possible, and trying to figure out how some of the red tape that you all heard about as you were discussing transfers as an element of the reliability strategies. You asked the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board to put together a work group working with stakeholders as well to identify some ways to both reduce impediments to transfers and also to protect water rights and environmental resources, and give you a report back on that. And then you set a deadline, too, on a determination you made that said that you didn't think transfers had a significant, one-year transfers had a significant effect on the co-equal goals. So you could consider that report as you moved ahead. And so that work has been underway. Kayvon Sampson's going to report about that and kind of the work we expect to do over the coming months to address this issue. So Kayvon, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, or is it good afternoon, council members. I guess I drew the short end of the stick having to follow Gavin's presentation, and also I am the only thing standing between you and your weekend, so I will try and be brief. The purpose of my presentation today is just to begin a discussion with you regarding water transfers and how they were addressed in the Delta Plan. As Dan summarized, and as you may recall, the Council has already determined that single-year transfers occurring through December 31st of 2016 do not have a significant impact on the co-equal goals for the purpose of determining whether a project meets the definition of covered action. What this means is that currently single-year transfers are not covered actions, but that those same transfers come 2017 could be covered actions, and unless the Council takes action. You can think of today's presentation as kind of a pregame or warm-up for the main event, which I hope to bring to you in September, which we will have some of the regulatory and some of the technical experts back here to provide new information. And if we start the presentation. Again, all I'd like to accomplish today is to remind everyone where we left the topic of single-year transfers back in 2012 and 2013 when the Council adopted the Delta Plan, and maybe give you a schedule of how we can move forward. Any new information that we have on this topic will be provided by experts, DWR and the State Board, at a later briefing. For those of you who were here in 2012 and 13, this presentation will just be a refresher of how the language was formulated, and for those new council members, this will kind of be a very generalized, high-level discussion of water transfers. And some of the points that I'd like to hit today are, first, what is a water transfer? How do they work? And in our discussion, we're going to focus primarily on those north to south transfers, the ones that use the state facilities, the State Water Project or the CVP facilities, to be moved from the Delta watershed down into the San Joaquin Valley. I should note that water transfers are very common, and this is just a subset of that. So what are the most common types of water transfers? We'll touch upon that. Also some of the timing and some of the conflicts that happen with that, both from the perspective of a party to a water transfer, but then also from the agencies who operate the facilities and the timing that they're constrained to. And there are some risks to water transfers, so we might touch upon that briefly as well. A next major point would be the focus on the existing regulatory oversight of water transfers, specifically single-year transfers and then the oversight that are provided to those transfers that use the facilities. I will then walk you through some of the council's major discussion points and concerns from 2012 and 13. Both when we adopted the recommendation, WRR15, but also when we walked you through and you guys adopted a determination that single-year transfers that occur through December 31st, 2016 would not have a significant impact on the co-equal goals for the purpose of determining whether a project meets the definition of covered action. And lastly, I would just like to give you a preview of what future council meetings may hold, and list a couple of potential actions that the council may wish to consider ahead of those meetings. So the most common types of water transfers. Well, let me back up. Water transfers, as we know, are a great tool for moving water to where it is needed most. You can have transfers among neighbors within a water district. Those are very simple to execute, don't have regulatory oversight. Or you can have transfers that move water hundreds of miles from northern part of the state through rivers, canals, pumping plants, down to southern part of the state. Water transfers can be single-year transfers, meaning they occur just for this calendar year or season, or they can actually be multi-year transfers. An example of a multi-year transfer would be the Yuba Accord, where they are transferring water south over a long term. These transfers, also there's exchanges, and an exchange would be where water is provided to a buyer this year, but then at a later date that water might be given back to the seller. So, and then there's also combinations of transfers and exchanges, and pretty much the creativity of the people entering into a transfer is the only limit to the characteristics. And while transfers occur all over California, I think the most abundant transfers are intra-basin transfers. There is a lot of water that is transferred among farmers and water agencies in Southern California, and there are a tremendous amount of water that's transferred among the parties in Northern California as well. But today we're going to focus on those transfers that involve the Delta, those that originate in, terminate in, or those that transect the Delta en route from the seller to the buyer. The majority of water being transferred through the Delta are those north to south transfers. There are some transfers that do terminate in the Delta. There's probably some transfers that do originate in the Delta, and I think in the future there's some signs that might become more common. But we're going to talk about the ones that head south, and those are the ones that rely on the State Water Project and CVP. And I should note that as a result of the biological opinions, both the State Water Project and the CVP are limited to transferring water only in a July through September window. That's when their impacts to Delta smelt are lessened. And so let's talk now about the most common types of water transfers. So groundwater substitution transfer. In this case, a seller who has a surface water right decides that they're going to forego that surface water and make it available for transfer, and they're going to pump groundwater instead. This would make the amount of the groundwater that they pump available for transfer, less stream flow depletion, As we know that groundwater and surface water are connected, so there is a stream flow depletion factor applied to that. Another common type of water transfer would be a crop idling or crop shifting transfer. In this case, the amount of water that a farmer might apply to their plot of land is decreased, either by idling the land or by shifting to a lower water requirement crop. And the reduction of the amount of the water the crops would consumptively use, and this isn't critical, it's consumptive use, which is calculated as the evapotranspiration of the applied water. That is what's available for transfer, not the amount of water that the farmer would have applied to their field. And then less common, but still a common type of transfer would be a reservoir storage transfer, also known as reservoir re-regulation. It's when a seller who has water currently stored behind a dam releases that water for transfer. The water that is released is in addition to the existing the normal operations of that reservoir. And DWR has provided what I think is a very good document, and it's attached to your staff report that goes into further detail here. And they also touch upon these items. So the water transfer process and schedule. This is a very busy slide. I don't expect you to really read it right now, but what I would like you to take away from it is that if you want to have, per this schedule, which is supplied by DWR, if you want to have a water supply occur or water transfer occur now in the summer, you had better have started the process in January. If you didn't start in January, you're late, and that could impact your transfer. As I said, there are some risks to transfers. In 2008 and 2009, the biological opinions, they came up with some regulation that only allows the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project to move water south during that July through September window. This limited window can kind of exacerbate some of the challenges that water transfers have. One of the types of challenges they have is curtailment. You may in January decide that you've identified a water transfer you'd like to have happen, but because you have to wait for July to have that water become available and transferred to you, in a year like this year and last year, the state board could curtail that surface water right, and that water would no longer be available for transfer. There's export capacity. When the pumps are running, their primary focus is to move project water. If the hydrologic conditions are right, they're going to be moving as much water as they can, and there may not actually be physical room to move transfer water on top of that. There's delta outflow requirements that add challenges as well. When you want to have a transfer that originates north of the delta and you're going to come through the delta, they add carriage water to that, and that's the water that's going to contribute their fair share to the water quality requirements of delta. So it's almost as a transaction cost. So if a farmer releases a certain amount of water, a portion of that will be transferred south, but the remaining will actually flow out through the bay. Now the issue with carriage water is it's hard to calculate. So there is a risk that at the time when a transfer is conceived, you might have an idea of what you expect that carriage water to be. When the actual transfer occurs, that carriage water requirement might actually be greater, in which case the buyer would receive less water. Also, reservoir operations can add a little risk to a water transfer. Again, not very common, but if you have water behind a reservoir that you want to make available for transfer, your water is secondary to project water, and you can think of it as sitting on top of project water. And if prior to July, the hydrologic conditions are great, and the reservoir actually has to make releases to have some flood storage capacity available, it's that stored water that you wanted to have transferred is what gets spilled first. Project water would be protected. So transfers do have oversight. Again, this is a very busy slide. The takeaway from this slide, and this slide pertains to those north to south transfers that go through the project facilities. is that they are reviewed either by the State Board, by DWR, or by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. The State Board has regulatory authority over post-1914 water rights. So all post-1914 water rights must petition the board for a change in point of diversion, and the State Board must issue an order approving that change before the water can move. Now, on top of that, the sellers who want to transfer water using the project facilities must first enter into a contract with DWR or USBR. Both USBR and DWR will make independent findings and review that transfer before agreeing to move it. There are a small subset of transfers that would avoid review by these three agencies. These are water transfers that include a pre-1914 water right as the seller, and they are not exported from the Delta using these project facilities. Examples might be pre-1914 from up in the Sacramento Valley watershed that proposes to sell water to someone such as Contra Costa Water District, or somebody who might pick up that water through the Freeport pumping plant. That would probably avoid some of this review. I should note that single-year transfers that petition the State Board for a temporary change are exempt from CEQA. Since water transfers involving pre-14 water rights do not petition the State Board, they are not exempt from CEQA, and they actually are still required to perform a CEQA analysis. So this is another helpful document from DWR. This outlines what the three agencies, what their overview and oversight looks like. With respect to the State Board must find that the proposed transfer will not injure any legal user of water and will not unreasonably affect fish, wildlife, or other in-stream users. DWR has a slightly different role. Their first and foremost is they calculate that there is real water, or new water as it's being called today. That is, that the system actually, minus the transfer, or that the transfer would actually add additional water to the system. That would be the new water that's available for transfer. In addition to the new water calculation, DWR needs to find that the transfer will not impact operations of the project. The water transfer does not injure any other legal user of water, nor will the proposed transfer unreasonably affect fish, wildlife, or other in-stream beneficial user, as well as the overall economy or the environment of the transfer area, meaning where the water was made available. USBR also determines that the water involved, or the transfer involves real water or new water. They also look that the transfer will have no adverse impact on contractors, water supply or operations. They meet fish and wildlife obligations, and they also look at groundwater conditions in the transfer in the originating area. Both DWR and the Bureau also make sure that the respective CEQA or NEPA documentation is completed. So what did we talk about a couple years ago? Well, the council discussed single-year transfers and when developing the Delta Plan, and was aware of all the information that I've already provided you. So the council, in their deliberations, you found that you understood the importance of water transfers as a tool to increase water supply statewide. In particular, the council understood the importance of single-year transfers and actually sought ways that they and the Delta Plan could help transfers and see if the process for approving transfers could actually be improved. But the council also wanted to better understand the impact of water transfers on the Delta. Did the change in timing of stream flows associated with water transfers have an adverse impact on the Delta ecosystem? What was known about any adverse impacts resulting from water transfers? The council also had concerns about the lack of oversight on a small subset of single-year transfers. Again, a transfer that would include a pre-1914 seller and an export from the Delta that doesn't include the projects. The council had concerns also about reoccurring single-year contracts. The concern was that these could be used in lieu of multi-year contract agreements, and by doing so, they would actually avoid analyzing any long-term impacts. So during the time that the council was wrestling with this, we didn't have a lot of the information that we needed for the council to make a strong determination. Staff initially proposed the language that's before you on this slide for a Delta Plan recommendation to try and get DWR and the State Board to look at these concerns and report back to the council what they had found. The council felt this recommendation needed additional focus on the reoccurring single-year transfer issue and ultimately adopted this recommendation. Now, I should note that Governor Brown on May 20th, 2013, and also again on April 25th, 2014, issued an executive order also directing DWR and the State Board to expedite the review and processing of water transfers. With the existing oversight that's applied to water transfers, the council, you were cautious about the potential to disrupt transfers through the application of additional regulatory oversight, i.e. the council's authority over covered action. Now, as a council, you have the discretion to define categories of activities that will or will not have a significant impact on the co-equal goals, and you actually did so in this case. The council determined that single-year transfers occurring in the near future through December 31, 2016 would not have a significant impact on the co-equal goals. However, the council did not have enough information to determine if single-year transfers beyond the 2016 horizon pose a significant risk to the Delta. Pending a report back from DWR and the State Board on WR-R15, the council made the determination temporary, and you adopted in the Delta Plan this regulation. Unless the council decides to take action, this determination that single-year transfers do not have a significant impact on the co-equal goals will expire at the end of next year. Starting January 1, 2017, all water transfers, including single-year water transfers, would be subject to the council's authority over covered actions and could be required to file a certification of consistency with the council. Now that we're all up to speed on where we left things in 2013, it's time to look forward and see if new information can be presented to the council. In September, I'd like to anticipate bringing DWR and the State Board before you to brief you on their efforts on WR-R15, if they have any recommendations to reduce the impediments to water transfers and also protect water rights and environmental resources, which also includes any recommendations on how to deal with the potential issue of reoccurring single-year transfers. I'd also like to suggest that the council hear from other experts and stakeholders regarding single-year transfers and what impacts that they might have on the Delta. You know, some other ideas for panel members could include the science program could convene they could actually come before us and talk about the science, or they could convene a panel of experts, possibly the Independent Science Board. Council may wish to hear from environmental organizations that have actually raised concerns about the recurring single-year transfer issue. Fish agencies that were actually part of the work group that DWR and the State Board were working with these last couple of years. You know, we might bring them in as well. And then maybe just some parties to water transfers, both representing the buyers and the sellers. Chairman Fiorini was part of an Aqua panel that had great discussion on this, and I think his co-panelists would be great suggestions for a future panel. And ultimately, the council will have to decide if they want to take action on this issue. Do you want to extend the current Delta? Do you want to extend the current Delta Plan approach? Or would you require that single-year transfers file consistency determinations as covered actions under the Delta Plan? So possible things to think about as we move forward is if you take no action and allow the determination to expire, as I said, starting January 1, all water transfers, including the single-year ones, could be subject to the council's authority over covered actions. The council could consider extending or making permanent the determination that single-year transfers don't have a significant impact on the co-equal goals. This would require an amendment to the Delta Plan regulations and would require submission of the new regulation to the OAL process. This could take some time. This action would also require a review of the Delta Plan ZIR to ensure that the new regulation or the amendment was considered in our environmental analysis. And if it's not, then we might have to actually look at environmental impacts of any new regulation or amended regulation. You may actually consider amending the determination to become permanent, but yet exclude a subset of single-year transfers that meet the criteria that you would establish. This would also require going through the OAL process and a CEQA evaluation. Additionally, the council may consider changes to the council policies and how the Delta Plan relates to water transfers. And you could do this based on the discussion and testimony that I hope to bring before you later. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and if you have any questions.
Great research, great report. Questions? Okay, we have some public comment requests, beginning with Michael Jackson. Pat, do we have others besides these two? Okay, thanks.
Michael Jackson, representing Aqua Alliance, a group in the Sacramento Valley that has been working on water transfers from the Sacramento Valley through the Delta to people south of the Delta since a 1991 and 1994, what is they consider a local catastrophe, from projects that suddenly drain groundwater. The streams holding endangered species begin to slip into the groundwater table from the pumping. And there are 17,000 wells in Butte County of individual people, and those wells, not all of them, but many of them begin to go dry. So from that time, they've been confronting one-year water transfers, and now it's an issue all over the all over the Sacramento Valley as the big rice farmers begin to drill deeper wells, transfer more water, and what is seen by the local agricultural community and the local environmental community as double dipping. They get paid exorbitant amounts for their water, and then they turn around and pump out of the community groundwater asset and get paid for their crops in the same way they'd always been paid. Suffice it to say that the nut farmers in the Sacramento Valley don't like the rice farmers over this issue. Because of that, as this went forward, there were requests of the Bureau, which controls most of the surface water in the Sacramento Valley, that they do a long-term transfer document and the research necessary to justify it. That was not done until the last couple of years, and we now have lawsuits, which I'm not going to get into the lawsuit, but I'm going to describe why people are interested. The first interest I've described, it's taking the community groundwater pool, dropping the groundwater table, and sending it elsewhere in a substitution format. The second interest is that 4 years ago we had Delta Smelt. Now Peter Moyle says we may not. I mean, it may have gone extinct during the time period where you made your decision that there was no impact. What we worry about is that as curtailments have happened, as flows have gone down, there is a great increase in the percentage of water going through the Delta in this key time that is transfer water. And it is also water that, and that's why the fisheries groups are involved, CSBA, CWIN. The reason that the Delta agricultural agencies, Central Delta and South Delta, are part of the lawsuit is they believe that the upstream, in particular the rice farmers, are diverting water that is natural flow in denial of the right to the riparians downstream to some of the flow. And that once it becomes sold down south, basically the riparian flow drops. They're being curtailed and would not be curtailed from the natural flow as riparians who have better rights than the projects. So in order to explain, I see the red light. In order to explain that, the wonderful suggestion that some of us who've been working on this for years and years and years ought to also do a panel. We would like to be part of that panel, the stakeholder panel. I would suggest Aqua Alliance, CSPA for the fishery reasons, and the Delta farmers in Central Delta and South Delta. And we can come in and lay out why this is not so easy and why it can be so dangerous, particularly now.
Duly noted. Thank you. Next up, John Mills, of the offices of John Mills.
Same clients as yesterday, upstream water agencies, some actively interested in transferring water, some looking at it, but all interested in it. First, I want to point out, in the context of where we are today, the changes in influence, I think, the influences that have changed since 2013. And maybe we should have seen these coming, but quite frankly, the last 4 years have been a surprise to all of us in the water business, some of the stuff we've never seen before. One is a drought resiliency reality check. We had some assumptions about a lot of systems. I'm speaking predominantly about upstream, where we don't have the advantage of desal. The cost of hauling in the salt is too expensive to do those projects, so we have to rely on fresh water. But we found out that a lot of these systems are beautiful. They're old systems, but they're like spun glass. And once they break, you can't reassemble them. And what's happened in the hydrograph in the last 4 years has shattered some of these systems. So we have to reinvigorate the resiliency of those systems upstream, and that's pushed people into new types of management that, quite frankly, we probably should have been years ago, but we're there now. And I want to point out that the influence of increased water use efficiency, we've seen dramatic improvements in water use efficiency upstream in the last 4 years as a result of the drought. And also, a side influence of the DWR IRWM program is a much more broad, what I would call stewardship-based, multi-agency regional approach to water problems. And that happened to have occurred before the drought hit, and that really saved a lot of our communities from running out of water. I do have clients who are trucking water into communities in the Sierra Nevadas, of all places. So it's tragic, but that's where we are. But I want to point out, this is one of those unintended consequences, perhaps, of the IRWM program, but it was a lifesaver. And it was a place where OPR and OES went to work with everybody, because they could find them all in the same meeting room. The view of the future setting of water is changing from where we were just a few years ago. And again, I'm not talking about coastal urban California. The folks down south have been doing a great job on this for years. But stormwater and recycle water, and also something we touched on yesterday, the role of headwaters, forest management, watershed restoration is becoming huge as a potential supply source for improving the resilience of our watersheds. Finally, the value of water is on a huge upswing, and that's partially being influenced by what we see downstream. It's kind of a balloon payment coming due, and that's Sigma. We've got some groundwater basins that are going to have some supplemental supplies, and so that's going to be an influence too. After that, I just have some questions for you, and I think these are questions that should be discussed in the context of where do we go next. I'll say, as I've looked at your 3 bullets here and your recommendations, amending the determination to become permanent, probably the one I would go with the specific findings. But against that backdrop, I'd say, is this going to be dealt with separately, or is this going to be wrapped up into the larger principles gathering that we have related to BDCP? Secondly, the question is, are there specific single-year transfers or sequences of single-year transfers that have been specifically identified as problems? And if so, then that probably needs to be addressed in any new principles. The water transfer classifications, don't include, I don't think, the conserved water emerging technologies and efficiencies, and probably in your categories that were put up of reservoir reoperation, groundwater recharge, and ag fouling, you ought to really include conservation in there, the efficient use of water. Consumptive use is changing dramatically. We're establishing pretty good baselines on that, so we know what's happening. And that's going to be increasingly either upstream transfers back and forth or downstream through the delta. That will be a source of water. And then will the policy that is developed for this ultimate decision reflect these regional processes better? Because I really think that's one area we could learn from. There's some folks in Southern California who can talk about what they're doing in reducing reliance on the Delta through cooperative regional efforts that are dramatic. I've actually taken some of my clients down there for tours and said, look at what they're doing. This is where we need to be. And I think that also is happening upstream. And that needs to be recognized. So when you get ready to move ahead on this, I think these are high-level policy questions that might guide some of the debate. But I would urge you to please think about these questions and about the changes that have happened since 2013 and about the horrible 4 years we've just gone through, and let's hope it's the last year of the 4-year situation, not the fourth, the fifth year. But I think transfers are going to play an important role in the Delta. They're also going to play an important role upstream, and how you treat them on single-year transfers, I think at a bottom line, one thing we learned this year is when there's an emergency, a lot of your standard objections and rules go out the window. Nobody likes having a CAL FIRE helicopter fill their bucket in their swimming pool, but you know when the fire's on the hill right behind you, nobody cares that CAL FIRE's there filling that bucket in your swimming pool. And it's the same with the drought. A lot of institutional barriers and political turf battles disappeared during this drought by necessity. And as Churchill said, sometimes we don't have to do what we can do, we have to do what we must do. And that's where we are in this drought. And that's where we're going to be in transfers in the future. Thank you.
John, Michael, Kivan is taking notes, and we'll incorporate your thoughts into next steps. Anything further? Kivan, nothing more?
No, we don't.
Okay, great, thanks. It's a great start, and we'll hear more from you in the succeeding months. Dan?
I was just going to remind us we're getting together next on the 27th and 28th, if we don't have anybody else to comment, and kind of look ahead to that.
Okay. We do have two requests for, well, that concludes file item 16.